Thanks, everyone. Lovely to see you all this afternoon. Hope you've all had a good day so far. So I want to talk about how to unlock the real value, the real commercial value of B2B brands. And in some respects, I wanted to go back to the start, or at least the start of this presentation, maybe. Here we go. So through the 60s and then culminating in some respects in 1970 with this article in the New York Times, Milton Friedman really doubled down on the idea that an organization, a company, only really has one purpose whatsoever, and that is to make money, to make profit. And in fact, in this article, he's railing against GM, who earlier that year were running a shareholder meeting and were trying to get onto the board a couple of particular individuals so that they could think about pollution and the community and issues that were kind of outside of their kind of shareholder spectrum, so to speak. And he thought this was a terrible idea, and that the only social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. And that idea of brands and businesses being there wholly solely to generate profit has very much been the established doctrine since then. So much so that the Business Roundtable, which is a very significant and influential kind of industry body in the States, in '97 said, well, as their statement of purpose, that the principal objective of a business enterprise is to generate economic returns to its owners. So it's all very simple and single-minded and whatnot. But what's really interesting about this, and what actually changed this presentation about a week ago, was that they updated their presentation as of the end of August to state that we share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders. And it's not just shareholders, but also the kind of commitment that a business has towards customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. And each of these 5 groups play an important role insofar as how you might generate value. And so it is a broader perspective on what a business's purpose is and therefore where a brand fits within that. Now, that might not be new news to all of us, and certainly a company with whom we do lots of work both in Australia and around the world is Macquarie Group. And Macquarie has lots of people who've been there for a long, long time. And Macquarie is one of those organisations where there's lots of unspoken, kind of unwritten kind of rules, if you like, or principles by which they abide, but don't necessarily turn up in strategy documents. And one of those is this notion that, yes, they're very much in business to make profit, but it's the way we do business that defines us. And I think you would have all been hard-pressed to have avoided any kind of dialogue on purpose, whether it's Simon Sinek or turning up on blogs and places like Mumbrella and wherever else it might be. And I'll come back to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but fundamentally what this talks to and really resonates with me is the notion that, yes, we have a clear purpose, and we can argue the toss insofar as, whether their purpose is sufficiently compelling, whether it's too narrow on profit or might need to be broader. But what's interesting is it's not necessarily the why that's the compelling part, it's the how. And actually how they do business is the thing that defines them. And I think in B2B at large, and then B2B branding specifically, it's people, it's relationships, it's how we do the things that we do that generate so much value insofar as what distinguishes us and what really focuses our people and how we might go to market and relate to one another and relate to customers. That I think that fundamentally is, helps us shift from the brand just being something on a business card that is a set and forget, handed over and it's gone, to being something much more valuable insofar as a business asset that is something that's kind of geared within the organisation. And that's really, I suppose, where I want to dive in insofar as how do we help organisations ensure that we can distinguish between those two things and make the shift. And so when we come back to this question about how we might unlock a brand's commercial value, and there's a few quotes that have all happened or been said to me in the last 2 or 3 months that I wanted to include in this presentation. Something that was said to me by an investment manager in financial services, a client of ours, B2B Finance: I undervalue things that are harder to quantify, which is not necessarily a surprising thing to kind of hear from an investments manager in a B2B finance business. And if we're going to unlock its commercial value, then we need to be able to demonstrate how we might quantify that. Now, that individual thought it was quite hard to quantify the value of a brand, but actually it's relatively easy. It's there if we look for it, and I just wanted to show you a few of the ways in which that might come to life. So at Future Brand, we run Future Brand Index every couple of years, and without going into the detail of that, what we can demonstrate empirically is that if you work for a stronger brand, you will over-index, your company, your brand will over-index versus the average insofar as people wanting to work for that company or indeed people wanting to buy from it. And so we can demonstrate, that a stronger brand does translate into, your ability to attract from a recruitment point of view and also from a customer acquisition point of view as well. Now, if you look outside of Future Brand, BCG a couple of years ago put together a great study in terms of the impact of purpose and what is a wonderfully alliterative, captivating headline around the purpose performance payoff. Insofar as TSR's total shareholder return, those organizations with high purpose scores basically double their TSR performance. So if you have a stronger purpose, you naturally have it correlates with a stronger financial performance. And I think that's really interesting insofar as prosecuting that idea of is purpose just a cute idea or does it actually have a commercial impact? This is a little thing that we had to play with off the back of Future Brand Index, which is to take the top 10 brands and then benchmark those around other exchanges around the world insofar as performance. And if you take those top 10 brands globally, they outperform the various indices. So clearly those brands are doing something right. But what's most simple for me, and the one that invariably we find ourselves using when talking to businesses around the role of their brand and the value it might provide, is the role that it plays in driving decisions. And so if you think about the decisions you make as a customer, where you might put your business or buy products and services, it might be the price, it might be the product, it might be the brand, it might be the sales experience or the service, or it might be a whole range of other things. And so when you run a quantitative choice study to understand discretely how each of these dynamics play a role in driving choice, well, inevitably brand is somewhere between 0 and 0. And depending on your business, the sector in which you operate, the nature of your products and services, it's probably around 15 to 20% at a guess. There's a McKinsey study I saw the other day in a particular sector. I think it was kind of enterprise telco, and it pretty much had these 5 things all at 20% each, which suggests it's no one of these things that's the most important factor. It's not any one thing in particular. It's a combination of these things. But there's no disregarding the fact that at least in that case, brand accounted for 1/5 of what made people make a decision. And so as much as you can kind of talk to grander ideas around kind of financial performance and stock exchange figures or whatever it might be, fundamentally, brand plays a role in helping your customers make a decision around whether or not to choose you. And I think we have to understand it in that very basic context in terms of it driving some kind of an outcome, driving some kind of a decision. So as much as it's valuable, and I think it's actually not quite as hard as that individual believed to demonstrate the commercial value of a brand or be able to quantify the brand. And as much as we would all in this room recognize that, even if others might not, in many of the conversations I've had of late, it seems that we do need to go back to basics in terms of some brand 101. So I think on the one hand, we can go, yes, brand is valuable, we can demonstrate it, it plays a role in driving decisions. However, as a client put it to me the other day, CMO of a B2B tech business, we are terrible at our elevator pitch. We are clueless in terms of articulating who we are and what we do. So forget about trying to demonstrate the value. Let's just try and explain to people what it is that we do day to day. And I think that's critical in terms of being able to define and articulate your brand and what you're about and how you might go to market. And it seems to be a thing that many B2B brands struggle with. The second is, if you can get past that, then you run into brand as a dirty word, as was said to me by the GM of marketing at a law firm, so professional services. So forget trying to prove the value of brand or even trying to articulate it. It's like we can't even use that as a concept to rattle around the business. We have to talk about image or reputation or, who knows what it might be. And I think we need to kind of almost rebuild what it is that brand can do for a business if it's going to have that credibility and validity. And then even if we get past that point, as was said to me just the week before that by the B2B head of marketing in a commercial property business, Well, we need a set of brand statements that aren't jargon, but are true to remove the confusion. So even if we can get past what are we going to call this and whatnot, we still get locked in talking about jargon, which is confusing for ourselves, least of all anyone else who doesn't necessarily work in our business, because all of these things, purpose, proposition, etc., positioning, all kind of get confused with one another insofar as exactly what it is that we're talking about. And so there's still some very basic things which I think we're kind of still struggling with in terms of B2B branding and marketing and really having an impact. Or at least those are 3 very real statements that have been shared with me, like literally in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So where to start? For us, it comes down to a combination of DNA, insight, and foresight. So DNA is really what it is about your organization that makes it tick, what makes you you. And it's not as though you're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It is a continuum. Insight is insight into customers and also your employees. Brand is just as important for employee attraction as it is for customers. And then foresight. So let's not rebrand or reconceptualize or re-strategize this every 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. It's like, let's make sure we're looking ahead insofar as how those competitive dynamics might be changing, how the market might be reshaping itself, and make sure we future-proof with a degree of foresight whatever it is that we might be doing. So to relate that back to those 3 quotes, with the professional services brand, the law firm brand, they've been in business for 100 years. So let's really understand the strength of that DNA, because that's largely why many of those people have joined. It's a very strong kind of thread within that organization. So let's really understand what that story, so that if we're going to build upon it and re-articulate it, it comes from a place that is genuine and true. In terms of insights with the property brand, and this isn't a criticism of them necessarily, I'm still so surprised by how many B2B brands don't research their customers. And I was in fact talking about 3 months ago with another professional services firm who essentially refused to research their customer base because they really didn't want to know what they thought. It was quite contrary, just given the nature of what they did, to not want to know what your clients thought about you. So conducting that research, whether it's quant or qual, but something's better than nothing. But in that case, around the property brand, insofar as some statements that aren't jargon but are true, well, let's understand it from the customer's perspective. And what do they say about us when we've left the room? And then in terms of foresight and the technology brand, well, let's understand that product roadmap. Let's understand, and they've got a product roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years. Now, that might change. There might be a degree of ambiguity, but let's point ourselves in the right direction, because more so than ever, we seem to be going back to that idea that kind of product is the new branding or product is the new marketing. And I'm always excited when I see people have got titles like the GM of sales and marketing, insofar as those things working together, or a kind of an EGM of product and marketing. We seem to kind of unbundle too many things. And so, being able to understand that product roadmap and what's going to set the platform for that experience, I think is critically important. So that's where we start, those 3 lenses. I thought that might be valuable to share with all of you. And then from there, it's really about defining that brand. And I wanted to come back to this purpose point. And my fundamental, I suppose, notion here is no one walks around going, hello, what are you? Or hello, why are you? Everyone walks around going, hello, how are you? I think fundamentally, in terms of people and us as humans and the nature of relationships, which really qualifies the nature of B2B branding in many respects, it doesn't necessarily come down to the purpose and why you might be here and why your organization might exist. The thing that many people find much more compelling, and indeed much more distinctive, is this idea of how are you? Kind of, how are you feeling? What is this experience? What is this feeling that we want to generate? And if we think about brands kind of stretching beyond the marketing team, and actually everyone having a role to play in delivering that brand experience, irrespective of where they might sit in the organization, that idea of a feeling or an emotion, how you might want someone to respond, I think is far simpler and far more useful insofar as how the rest of your organization might use that. No one's going to run off and knock out a quick A5 flyer or a little display ad. but everyone can use that idea of how do I want this customer to feel as a consequence of my interaction with them. So a couple of examples here. One is ours, one is not ours insofar as future brand. So this first one is work that we did with Staples and helping them rebrand from Staples to Wink. And so they are, in very simple terms, in kind of office supplies, office solutions. And this is what that world looks like. And it's very much a world where work is a chore. Work is necessary, it's just what you need to get done. Whereas we all know that work is now motivating and fulfilling and emotional and full of life. And we all work in kind of activity-based work environments, and everyone's kind of hot desking and all those different things. And it's far more creative and emotional than it's ever been. And so, in a world where work is a chore, Wink was designed to feel like a breath of fresh air. That yes, we worked on a strategy and conceived of a positioning and then designed the identity around it. But when I stood up at Brand Camp and helped them launch that brand to the business and talking to the sales team, I said, look, if there's one thing that you remember, and forget everything else, if there's one thing that you remember, it's that feeling of in interacting with the customer and indeed one another. If that can feel like a breath of fresh air versus all the competitors in the marketplace, then you're delivering in some small way that brand experience. And so, that obviously has messaging and identity and whatnot around it. And part of the thinking behind the name was it was to feel much more modern and progressive and almost a little bit techie insofar as that very short, succinct, monosyllabic style, to really distinguish them from everything else that was quite boring and cheap and cheerful and just made work look quite boring. And so they were very much for a much more creative world of working and learning. So then the other example is a little bit meta insofar as this is a photo I took at the Mumbrella Finance Marketing Summit of Natalie Disdale, who's the CMO of Athena. And a similar construct insofar as in a world where everyone's talking about getting a home loan and kind of channeling my inner Natalie for anyone who is there, no one's talking about getting rid of a fucking home loan. And in that, there's obviously an idea, but there's also a tone and a feeling. And, she talked very enthusiastically about swearing and, how that might inform the positioning of an organization and the experience around it. But it gives this very clear sense that they really don't give a fuck. And insofar as the status quo and the establishment, and they out and out want to be completely different. And that's then supported by this notion that they want to help you pay off your home loan faster. And these proof points, if you like, the first one is around the fact that a new customer will never get a better rate than an existing one. So if they put out there a new home loan offer, as an existing customer, you can access that as well. 30 months in a year is basically how the banks work it out. It's 12 equal payments, but those 12 equal payments are basically, based on a certain number of days per month. It's actually less than the number of days in the year. And so if you do it their way, you actually are paying 31 days in the month rather than 28, and so you can pay off your home loan quicker. And then number 7, fuck fees. And so like with the Wink example, where it was, well, we have this brand, what's the experience, the feeling that we want to generate? I think Athena had done a really good job of then taking that one step further, insofar as you've got an idea that then conjures a feeling and an emotion of how we want people to feel about the experience. But then they then have these proof points off the back of it for how you might set yourself apart. Now, they're a B2C business rather than B2B, so technically a little kind of out of the sandpit, but I think there's so much we can learn from this insofar as transferring ideas and insights from other areas. So I think that idea of we're not necessarily kind of designing an identity or a strategy, but more so a feeling or an emotion, I think is pivotal. And of course, that idea of emotion is backed up by the work recently by Lesbian and Peter Field, I think it's Peter Field in the UK. So they, if you haven't read this, you need to read it. They essentially did a B2C study and it kind of played out how important emotion was and differentiation, etc., etc., etc. And then bored, most likely, by all the people in the world who say, B2B branding's totally different. It's totally different from B2C. They went out and did the B2B study. And funnily enough, as you can see over here, so this is where emotion is more important than reason insofar as making decision-making. the red is where it's the same, and the blue is where it's less, you can see the bars for B2C are pretty much the same as B2B. There is no difference. And I think it's great to have research to support that. I think we could have all probably told ourselves that about 10 years ago. But the importance of emotion in B2B branding, cannot be underestimated. We're all people at the end of the day, and whether we like it or not, we make decisions emotionally. And there's lots of really cool studies done on this by people like Antonio Damasio, who's essentially done research on people with brain injuries who can't feel emotion. And long story short, if you can't feel emotion, you end up in a perfectly virtuous loop of indecision. And you have these kind of perfectly balanced arguments for should I, shouldn't I? And if you can't feel, and if you're reliant purely on reason, you become perfectly indecisive. Really interesting stuff around neuroscience. So emotion is critically important. And then I think in terms of the detail, interesting to see that in terms of brand effects, emotion's more important, but perhaps activation effects, reason is more important. So it's not one size fits all, but clearly there's a role for emotion to play. And I think as we try and expand our horizons as far as the B2B branding and how it works, it's like let's talk to our colleagues around the feeling that they want to conjure kind of in and around the organization. So then the second thing is, well, once we've got that, well, how do we tell that story? And mildly embarrassingly, I was involved in a project, and I won't say for whom, and it was B2C and B2B, called ECC. Somewhat ironically, this stood for Excellence in Customer Communication, which is a really bad way to get started on a project about communication, to give it a really shitty acronym. Because acronyms are just so anemic and anonymous and just so easily forgettable. But it's so important, the words that we use, because language is behavioural. So if I start shouting and swearing, you'll respond one way. If I start getting all academic and virtuous, you'll respond another. And so language does really shape people's responses and how they respond to you. And I think in a B2B context, more often than not, every organisation is using your brand through language. And I always joke that the two most popular words in branding are lorem ipsum. And I think it's so underutilized to not be able to activate the language in and around an organization, because people are using those words anyhow. Let's not choose them carefully. Let's choose them creatively and really have all the words that those people use really kind of put our stake in the ground around, what our brand is and what it stands for. And so again, another quick example from us for BCG Digital Ventures, so very kind of B2B enterprise, and the front page of their tone of voice guidelines that we produce as part of a whole suite of work. What does this button do? And it just conjures immediately the sense of curious, imaginative, we're going to break stuff, we're going to make stuff kind of an organization. And that really cuts through and gets to the heart of who they are and what they do. And given that so much of what they do, you can't tell people anyhow because it's so commercially sensitive. And even if you try to kind of talk about it, you very quickly find that you're talking about saving the world and changing the planet, etc. And it kind of feels a little bit hyperbole. It's much better to leave your audience guessing and let them imagine for themselves what this brand might be about. And then another example for a B2B property company is this. And I think this is really about language and application and their brochures. And like any other property company, it has these beautiful, heroic shots of their buildings. And that very much puts them in the category, and it's kind of a given. You've got to have those beauty shots and there's no getting away from it. But look closely, and the headlines talk about a structure struck in the 60s in desperate need of modern intervention, or an unrewarding second-rate retail experience. And what we wanted to do was, yes, play the game in terms of visuals, but then have the headlines talk to what it looked like before. And have that be juxtaposed in quite a jarring way, that we have these beautiful shots, but the language talks about just how much of a difference we made to that property, so much so you wouldn't believe it. And so we have these headlines that talk about asbestos in the walls and greasy burgers and vacant spaces to really show through language just how much of an impact we've made, and instantly set ourselves apart from every other property brand out there that's just playing the same game of using hyperbole every which way to say how great they are. And surprise, surprise, it all looks and sounds the same. So language is critically important. Desperate and dated on the world's doorstep. And now we'll look at it. And now look at how it looks. And I think that is a great entree for then that sales manager or leasing agent, whomever it might be. It kind of opens the window on telling the story of what did we did and how do we get there, and the before and the after. And it's a much more intelligent, sophisticated conversation that goes to the core of who we are and what we do. And so that all goes back to this idea of how do we equip people to actually deliver this brand experience. And I'm not sure if this is the exact quote, because I've read this book and reread it and I can't find it, but I swear it's in there somewhere. It's quite an old book now. His other great quote is, the definition of a customer is someone who's yet to find a better alternative. And so everyone who has a responsibility for a customer works in marketing by default. It's not just for the marketing department, but everyone who's interfacing or dealing with a customer in some way is delivering that brand experience, and so carries that responsibility with them. And so we need to think about how do we equip those people with the right tools and training, because nobody, and I mean nobody, is reading the 100-page guidelines document that you all shared and sweated and laboured over, but no one reads, and then it's out of date and whatnot. And so it has to be about how do we give people the right tools and give them the right training and the experience in and around that, than just relying on people to hope the answer's on page 32. And one of those tools is naturally language, insofar as how do we really gear our organisation around delivering that experience. So in terms of equipping your people, it comes back to that notion I said earlier, insofar as, well, emotion as a driver of customer experience. And how do we identify that driving emotion, embed that at the heart of our organisation, the ways in which we might go to market, and actually have our people understand that. Because at its simplest, if they know nothing else, if they can deliver that emotion, if we can hire people against that, well, then we're going to be delivering our brand for our customers. The second, and this is just an easy win, insofar as you're writing words, saying words anyhow, tenders, pitches, whatever it might be, but language is a tool for sales enablement. And how do we make sure that we're using words in a way that is as productive as possible in generating that perception of ourselves and also that experience in that fundamental notion that language is behavioural. And then, as I mentioned quickly earlier, the idea that the value of brand lies in employee engagement, and it's not just for customers, it's also for employees, insofar as if we can get this right, it can start from the inside out. And if we do that, then we move away from brand being this quite restrictive, limiting, straitjacket idea that feels like a uniform that we have to wear whether we like it or not, to brand as a platform that provides this springboard so that your sales team or product teams or whoever it might be can actually take the brand and run with it and use it as a jumping off point for doing all kinds of wonderful things that have a positive impact both inside and outside of the organisation. So in terms of making the shift from business card to business asset, yes, brands are valuable, but in order for us to really have that conversation with conviction, we need to understand the ways in which emotions drive decisions, the fact that language is behavioural and provides a really valuable opportunity, and then giving your people tools and training to actually do something with the brand, as opposed to having it siloed within one part of the organisation. So that's as much as I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much for listening. That's it.